Hi, this is David Douglas, Managing Director of EBO, the digital agency. EBO are the proud sponsors this year of Radio Molly and Molly's digital programme.
For centuries, romance fiction by Irish writers, from Lady Morgan to Marianne Keyes, has told the story of characters in love. Yet romance remains a target for public condemnation and critical contempt, in part because these popular novels have been written largely by and for women. In summer 2025, the Museum of Literature Ireland launched the exhibition Happy Ever After, Falling in Love with Irish Romance Fiction, to showcase and celebrate the unique character of Irish romance fiction. I'm Paige Reynolds, professor of English at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts and curator of Happy Ever After. My scholarly expertise rests in modern and contemporary Irish writing, and I'm the author, most recently, of Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing, The Stubborn Mode, from Oxford University Press. I'm also an enthusiastic reader of romance fiction. Broadly defined, romance fiction focuses on a love story and ends happily. The genre's appeal rests in its depiction of emotion, as well as its recognizable narrative structure, which follows characters as they fall in love and secure their happy ever after. In this series of interviews, I speak with Irish writers who focus on romance in its many and various iterations. These conversations reveal that the designation romance fiction remains a vexed and unfairly constrictive one, but they also confirm the important work done by love stories. Irish romance fiction promises us the familiar satisfaction of a happy ending based in human connection. It also voices aspirations for personal fulfillment and a better society by featuring characters who overcome internal and external barriers to happiness. The exhibition Happy Ever After, Falling in Love with Irish Romance Fiction, takes its name from a plot device that is essential to romance fiction: the happy ending. Traditionally, the happy ever after was the marriage between a man and woman. Today, characters find love in queer or polyamorous relationships, or choose friendship or independence as their happy ending. They're happy for now. The evolving nature of the happy ever after demonstrates that even as the genre promises readers a satisfying conclusion, it also adapts rapidly and readily to changing cultural conditions, and sometimes even anticipates those transformations. In this interview, we have the chance to explore the happily ever after, the flexibility of the marriage plot, and the complexity of romance fiction more generally with the author Naoise Dolan. Naoise is the author of two novels, Exciting Times from 2020, which centers on a love triangle set in Hong Kong, and The Happy Couple from 2023, which follows the Dublin couple Luke and Celine's complicated path to their wedding day. She's also an essayist and a persuasive advocate for concerns including the status of the Irish language, our enhanced understanding of neurodiversity, and the scope of queer identities. She puts her words into action, as seen in 2025 when she joined an aid flotilla sailing to Gaza. As such, Naoise is part of a long tradition of Irish authors of romance fiction who engage directly with contemporary conditions and seek to improve them. So the romance novel that we're looking at has a central romantic relationship with a happy ever after, or what's known in the trades as an HEA. And one of the things I've found most fascinating about romance fiction, and one of the reasons that I wanted to help with this show, is because of the kind of overlap in the term romance, right? So you have the medieval romance, you have literary fiction that has kind of romance as an engine, something like even Anna Karenina, right? Which of course ends wildly tragically, and yet is driven by that romance. And then of course women's commercial fiction. And so what I think is particularly striking about the Irish case has been a kind of tension, at least from my own work, which generally focused on experimental and incredibly dark contemporary women's fiction, is the kind of pleasure that goes with romance fiction. And so, again, during COVID, which was when I first read Exciting Times, rapidly, I was reading that along with commercial romance fiction written by American writers and sort of noticing how frequently those works really provided a kind of canary in the coal mine. So that in the Irish tradition, during the Celtic Tiger, when I first started my research here, I was learning about August stoves and sort of the kind of contours of the middle and upper middle classes during the Celtic Tiger first through writers like Sarah Hart or Marian Keyes. And then it was sort of subsequently that, writers like N. Wright would come back to it, and that would be incredibly helpful. So I thought, thinking about romance fiction as a canary in the coal mine for social issues, and then also the kind of fluidity in the Irish tradition among and between literary fiction and romance fiction. So I wanted to welcome you to this as the author of Exciting Times and The Happy Couple, but also for your background in writing opinion pieces and the ways in which you cover political conflict and climate, Irish language, European issues, and sort of have a wide-ranging public engagement with issues including neurodiversity and polyamory. But in particular, I wanted to start our conversation today by talking a little bit about what it means to think about Exciting Times and The Happy Couple as something under the rubric of romance fiction. Is that a term that you were conscious of, that you were embracing, pushing against? I mean, did you have a kind of, what were you thinking about romance, I guess, as you worked on each of these novels?
Not a whole lot, because the question that I try to resolve as soon as possible so that I can do the stuff that's interesting to me is, where will the book be set and what will it be about? And those are not ever my chief concerns. These are always incidental to how do I get to depict the texture of the characters' thoughts? How do I get to get dialogue going between them? How do I get to enter these rhythms and find new ways to weave sentences? And so I think romance is almost more setting than subject matter in that sense, because subject matter I would define as something that changes and that the text has evolving opinions about, that everything's gearing you to reconsider, whereas I don't think the portrayal of romance vastly differs from the first page to the last in either of these books. I think it's more a pretext for the interactions, which on other levels shift, but I don't know if my reader would come away from either of those books with an altered perception of romance compared to the one at the start, and certainly it wasn't my conscious aim to do that. But on the other hand, I do think I was in the lucky position of not needing to consciously distance myself from it either, because I came in a generation of Irish women writers to whom establishment literary recognition was much more accessible, and so I get elements of condescension, of course, compared to if I were a 50-year-old man, but it's nothing like what the previous generations went through. And so I don't see a need to write fervently and consciously against it, because it was never something that was limiting me or pigeonholing me in a way that it would have, certainly if I'd been writing even 10 or 20 years before.
Excellent. So in thinking about that, you wrote a really fantastic piece for The Guardian in May of 2023 about the marriage plot as you were publishing The Happy Couple, which pivots, as you know, around a wedding. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the marriage plot in The Happy Couple, right? So that in that article, I love the quote, right? A happy ending doesn't have to mean marriage. And I think that's such an incredibly powerful gesture that book makes. So could you maybe outline for people who are less familiar with the novel sort of what that arc looks like and sort of the ways in which you imagined yourself pushing against the marriage plot, right? So the marriage plot is a literary device which, as the name tells us, right, follows a couple as they fall in love, generally overcome a conflict, and then resolve the relationship either, again, through betrothal, but usually marriage. So famously, listeners will know Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, right, where Lizzie and Mr. Darcy meet, they have a conflict, they resolve the conflict, and at the end, they marry. So when you were thinking about The Happy Couple, can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking about marriage and the structural device of the marriage plot?
I was very interested in the perspective and subjectivity that goes into how we narrativize a relationship. And marriage is a very official organising device to centre those themes around, but I was quite determined not to limit it to the couple's vision. And so I came up with this structure with 5 narrators where not only the couple, but the groom, the bridesmaid, and a guest all weigh in on their understanding of the relationship and how they see themselves positioned to these people. And in some ways that was a way to narratively take a bit of power from the couple, because a marriage is supposed to be these 2 people telling the story of themselves and everyone else passively receives it. But when you've got this unruly chorus, you're able to challenge that and poke holes in it in ways I found quite enjoyable to do. But I think as well I was just interested in having an excuse to bring them all together at the end of the novel, and so having something official is a really good way to force that in our increasingly unstructured modern life. I think we have fewer and fewer forced group socialising, and it's a great pity for the novelist in many ways, because if people are only hanging out with those that they feel a natural inclination to, that's not a great source of conflict. So I also just wanted to have that big dramatic event at the end, and it could have been something else. It could have been a funeral, it could have been a birthday, but marriage was the one I landed on.
Yeah, and I love that you had said that you had not actually been to a wedding at the point that you wrote the novel. So were you thinking about sort of what had been going on in an Irish context? I mean, I find that this is a conversation I often have with Irish writers of sort of how alert you are to being Irish as you're writing a book. So, the idea that in Ireland, divorce was illegal until the 1995 referendum legalized it and was signed into official law in 1996. And then obviously later in 2024, the referendums on family and care. So I know as an instructor in America, my students are always stunned, right, that in the Constitution to this day in Ireland, it says that it's the job of the state, right, to ensure that the mother can remain in the home. And so when in 2024, Article 41 wanted to move the term marriage to durable relationships, right, and to change the term mother's duties to family care, that was a very alive and deeply problematic, largely because of language, right? I mean, that it seemed like lots of people were on board with sort of opening the definition of the marriage and sort of taking out the gender component in care, but it got really stuck on language for people both, conservative and more progressive thinkers. So was there anything about your own sort of understanding of or experience as someone Irish about marriage that you think may have shaped your understanding of the marriage plot or your representation of it?
I would say the first time I regularly thought about marriage as an institution was when I found myself irritated by the assumption that I should really want to be able to do it when we were leading up to the referendum in 2015. And this was something I got in so many arguments with about people, the benefits of being pragmatic and just rallying around the big gay issue since it is the one of the day, versus foregrounding what we might think is more important, even if it's less politically palatable or even if there isn't the same momentum. And I think in the end there was enough homophobia that in turn irritated me into caring. And so I did get involved in canvassing and so on towards the end. But until this question was being put to the public, should Naoise Dola be able to get married, it had never occurred to me to do such a thing, and it still never would. So I think marriage really, for me, has always just been something that if others call it into question, then I will consider it. But because I'm lucky enough not to have remembered the time when divorce was illegal, for example, it wasn't on my radar in the same way. Nonetheless, probably the legacy lingers in how we talk about things like divorce. I remember a quietness around my friends growing up whose parents were divorced, and I don't know if that taboo would have been the same in other countries. I don't really have a second childhood to compare it to, more's the pity. But since 2015 I've gone back to not thinking about marriage all that much, I must say, and I'm very relieved not to have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the 2015 same-sex marriage referendum was, as you say, something that once again kind of positioned a traditional and normative structure, on what had been understood as something that could really effectively and productively push against those norms in Ireland. And elsewhere, obviously, because we've had the same thing in the States, although not from a referendum, right? That we had to sort of do it through the back door with the judicial system. But it is, it's interesting that you point that out in terms of the representation of queer experience and trying to kind of fit it into these familiar structures and patterns, right? Because, that's another thing, I think a critique that's often lodged at popular romance fiction, right, is how formulaic it is. And one of my long-standing irritations, right, is the way in which we have been able to embrace crime fiction or science fiction or even the Western, right, because those are genre fiction forms tied more overtly with male writers and male experience, right? So romance fiction is and has historically been written by women for women readers, and that unsurprisingly contributes, I think, to a lot of the flack that it gets. But I do think that romance fiction in the States has done a really good job of opening up representations of queer experience, especially for younger readers. And I see that increasingly in Ireland as well, right? So that Casey McQuiston Red, White, Royal, Blue, right, was a sort of book that kind of broke that open. And sort of allowed, I think, a whole younger generation of readers to see their experience in what might be considered sometimes a kind of canned formula, but one that was driven by pleasure. So that one of the things I love about romance fiction is, the literary fiction books that I often write about, there's so many drownings, and so I'm always like, when I'm talking about Irish romance, there are just fewer tragic moments. So does that resonate with your experience in terms of the representations that you've seen in popular fiction of queer relationships?
I think it's definitely generally true that with popular fiction, it's easier to rally and assemble a readership who might not otherwise be interested in that sort of fiction at all, but because they're so starved of seeing themselves in books, they will cross genre, and potentially the very nature of popular fiction makes that easier to come about as well, because literary fiction, the whole point of it is to be weird about language in ways that not everyone will like. And so quite frequently I read queer literary fiction that I absolutely hate, whereas I don't think popular fiction has the same potential to make me absolutely hate it on the level of I can't stand another sentence of this. And so it is maybe an outlet for that sort of community-based buy-in that is important. And I think we're terribly narrow and binaristic when we talk about what fiction should do. And so there are camps who talk about I should be able to see myself, I should be positively represented, and there are camps who talk about characters shouldn't have to be these moral emblems, fiction should embrace moral ambiguity. And the answer obviously is that it should do all these things and many more. And so I'm thrilled that that kind of popular fiction exists. I'm thrilled that queer writers can also write dense, linguistically tangled books that don't appear to be telling you how to think. It's all good. More of all of it, please.
Yeah, the and both, I think, is a really important way to think about genre, and the kind of different types of work that they do. One of the stories that I told, my son was looking at colleges, and sort of one of the rites of passage for American high schoolers is to visit various campuses and to look at their dorm rooms. And one of the things that was remarkable to me as an instructor was increasingly my students don't know how to deal with narrative. That we've moved from moments when they used to sort of not read big novels, or they would just be reading Twilight, and I'd be, raise my hand to my brow, and then suddenly they were just kind of watching long form television, and then suddenly they were just watching TikTok, right? So the capacity to settle into a narrative, I think, has, because of COVID and because of changing educational standards, many of which are fantastic, right? Because they're about sort of broadening education to different populations, right? So there's a noble cause driving that. But I thought what was really fascinating as we did these college campus tours were the number of pink romance books on the shelves of these young women. And again, of course, strikingly, the dorms that we went in that belonged to young men did not have those. But the idea that sort of these varying experiences with different modalities of romance and sexuality were all represented, and a kind of commitment to narrative is a kind of gateway drug to, the sort of more sophisticated literary fiction, which, as you point out, is going to be doing different things formally or with language. I thought was just really fascinating, and the kind of work that does in the moment. So one of the questions I think I wanted to talk a little bit about with you coming out of that and sort of the notion of pleasure reading is the way in which you think about pleasure when you're writing, because I think both with Exciting Times and The Happy Couple, there is a kind of commitment to understanding the complexity of the characters as well as the experiences and emotions that give them pleasure. And so when you're thinking about that, particularly I think in a literary tradition that has, for all good reasons, been committed to unveiling sort of the darker aspects of human experience, what is your relationship as a writer to pleasure, right? How do you think about representing it? How do you experience it even as a writer when you're working on books like these?
Well, I have the benefit of having the least pleasure-shunning personality in the world. I do not do anything that I don't want to do for longer than 2 seconds, and it frequently makes my life very difficult. But as a result, a failure to take an interest in pleasure would be a failure to take an interest in myself, and we can't be having that. But I think as well, depicting something in a way that I find satisfying is always, in some sense, pleasurable for me, whatever experience it then generates for the reader. And I sometimes find that almost suspicious in myself, that when I'm writing a dark, traumatic paragraph, part of me is enjoying how well the sentences are flowing and how I picked the right word without even thinking about it. But I try not to be afraid of that, because I think the fear of pleasure is what makes us so insane as a country. And it's in a different way to the Protestant fear of pleasure, I think. I think the Protestant fear of pleasure is more about seriousness and uprightness as a person and just desert and all that, whereas the Catholic fear of pleasure is, I think, because the indulgence of guilt is so twisted and so profound that it almost horseshoes back to pleasure anyway. So we're very conscious of this thin line, and I'm very interested in that gap, that thin screen between the two, between profound misery and profound pleasure, because for me, who enjoys aestheticizing Annie and all experiences, there really isn't one. And it's of great consolation to me the number of times I've been absolutely devastated and thought, what material? And not even in the literal sense of writing about it, but just whenever I access any kind of deep emotion, I know that I can access something similarly deep, even if it's about something completely different, when I want to just remember, how did that feel?
No, that's fascinating. And I think, as you point out, there's also, it's not just about sort of being Catholic and being in a predominantly Catholic country, but also coming out of the abuse scandals. I mean, if you have an organization like 1 in 4, right, which is an organization named for the fact that 1 in 4 individuals in Ireland suffered from childhood sexual abuse, there's going to be a hardwired anxiety about and resistance to pleasure, because of course pleasure can also drive the most heinous of crimes. So, so to have that amped up, I think, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries by the sex abuse crisis, the childhood sex abuse crisis, or just the sex crisis in general, I think is really fascinating.
And also, more benignly at the point of pleasure itself, the fact that pleasure could then get you in deep trouble as a woman for most of this country's history.
100%. Yeah. Because it is fascinating. I have a rather deep knowledge of American romance fiction, again, as a kind of compensatory exercise from the sort of work that I was doing in my own research, but again, sort of, how do I prevent descending into all kind of problems during COVID when I'm locked in my house? What's going to give me a kind of not going to kill me pleasure, right? So the idea of sort of embracing that pleasure, I think, was crucially important. But it is really remarkable to me how suspicious we are of that. And it's also been remarkable to me, I think, sort of having a kind of wide swath of reading in recent romance fiction written in the States is the kind of hesitant engagement of depicting sexuality graphically in popular romance in Ireland. And I even think, in sort of literary fiction, that there is, I know Emma McBride has talked about this, but I'm wondering if you think about that representation, right? So that, again, because of the context of the show, to invoke the term from romance fiction marketing, right, which is spicy romance. There's not a lot of spicy Irish romance. So what do you make of that in terms of, do you see that as a kind of cultural hesitancy? And what do you think about writing intimate scenes as an Irish writer, or not even as an Irish writer, just as a writer? What are you thinking?
Well, for me, I'm just thinking about how do I get the purpose across for the characterization and the plot. I'm not thinking about giving my reader a direct sensory experience in that sense.
Right,
I'd be writing in a very different way if I did, but I think that's in line with how I write generally. I think I lean much more on cognitive realism than on somatic detail for how I portray my characters' emotions. And something that I've noticed recently that really bothers me is when great male American writers do that, no one accuses them of being cold or distant or prudish. Philip Roth, mostly cognitive realism, even Portnoy's Complaint. When he's writing about masturbation, he's writing about masturbation. It's not a cue for something else. David Foster Wallace, the most maximalist paragraphs of his aren't what's happening outside the characters' heads, it's inside them. And so I wonder, is there an expectation that women should primarily be bodily focused, and if they're not, it's somehow dishonest or avoidant? But in terms of Irish fiction more broadly, I wonder, is it just that we don't have the same commercial potential? We do have some huge commercial writers, but I can't think of any Irish writer who's, for example, become a millionaire off the new romantasy boon in the same way.
Right.
And so I don't know if it's a lack of interest so much as maybe a lack of being rewarded for it in the same way. And if you're not going to get that huge best-selling reach anyway, maybe you just find it more enjoyable to write something else.
Yeah, no, I do wonder, as I said, that there was so much kind of traction with Irish crime writing, and sort of what the sort of current boom in popular romance that's happening in the States, like the ways in which that may or may not trickle into the Irish tradition. Because, of course, Marian Keyes is that writer internationally. And to some degree, Edna O'Brien was, right? I mean, here's a writer who, as you point out, was not at the end of the day necessarily about the somatic experience, right? That was part of the story for her. But what she was really, I think, trying to represent were more the kind of social contours, right? And the kind of emotional and psychological ways that her characters are trying to sort of push against that or are being pushed by it, right?
Yes, and I think so seldom does she directly analyse the central friendship, and it's the theme of the book, absolutely. And I think that's very much the way Irish writers operate. Whatever you're told is the theme is not the theme, it's something else. And I think the sex even just plays into that theme at the end of the day. And I love that. I love that this largely... I have mixed feelings about the term complicated female friendship, because I think there's often an erotic undertone that is being Baudelarized in reducing it to, oh, it's so emotionally complex between them. The Frantic books, for instance, when they're physically bathing one another seems a simplification to say this is just a complicated female friendship. But nonetheless, I think Edna O'Brien, however we want to read The Two Girls, the fact that that's allowed to sit as the theme of the book and the men are there but they're not the chief agents, I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. To sort of go back to thinking about, say O'Brien's reputation, right? I like that amazing documentary, The Blue Road. I don't know if you had a chance to see it.
I did.
It was fantastic.
And also a huge reminder of how lucky I am that marriage was never a huge concern for me, because, God, things have changed.
Yeah, or even the scripts. I mean, as I said, one of the things that I loved about The Happy Couple was the kind of alertness of all of the characters of the scripts that they had been provided, right? Like that, the moment, and obviously because you're the writer, you'll remember with more detail than I, but the way in which Celine could recall all the narratives that she had seen on television or had read in books, right? About about heterosexual relationships as opposed to same-sex relationships, and the role that popular culture and reading experience played for her in kind of cementing expectations, and then even the same thing with Luke, right? And sort of with Uncle Grelin sort of giving him a different way to imagine manhood. That there seems to me, I think, a really fascinating and kind of noisy presence in contemporary writing right now in Ireland about those cultural scripts that have been provided, and a kind of alertness to our susceptibility, or rather your susceptibility to them, right? Once the rules of this is what a good Catholic nationalist man looks like, this is what a good Protestant man looks like, this is what a good Protestant woman looks like, this is what a good Catholic, woman looks like. Once those very sort of tightly scripted roles start to fall apart, right? Where it's not, to go back to the Constitution, that, it's my job to stay in the home with a child on my knee telling them about Irish history. Who are you? And the kind of overwhelming quality, both anxiety producing as well as pleasure evoking aspects of that freedom, right? I just think is like so perfectly encapsulated by both of your novels.
Thank you.
So,
and I think a factor in that kind of social examination that we're seeing in Irish novels is that the creative writing MFA hasn't taken the same foothold here. There are some in this new wave who have them, but a lot of the big names don't. I don't. And I think that gives you a freedom to overtly examine things that you want to overtly examine. I get the sense that in the US, this show don't tell maxim has extended well beyond its original confines to say that it's somehow cheap or unearned to ever talk directly about what you want to talk about. And that produces very bland, very predictable fiction where everything, you can see the writer checking off the 5 senses to make sure that they've sufficiently outlined where the character is and what they're feeling, and everything being told to you in this roundabout way that ultimately seems avoidant to me, and seems avoidant in the especially annoyingly couched term of like, this is real, this is raw, whereas fiction that takes a step back and allows itself to be overtly political without all these side doors is somehow portrayed as less authentic by that framework, which I find odd, given that you have to study very expensively to learn this authentic writing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because that is something even in sort of, grading undergraduate papers, we are constantly writing, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. So you're right, that is a maxim that it's super smart to be kind of conscious of, but also to push against. But I'm interested, and I'll just admit my own, fallibility in this logic. What do you make then of all of the kind of college romances that have been written in recent years by Irish writers, right? So, I'm thinking about like Emma Ryan's Holding Her Breath. I'm thinking about Hilary Fannon's. I'm thinking, there have been such a large number of those types of books, I think, that have been lazily attributed to the Sally Rooney phenomenon. But what do you think it is that has hooked writers on the college experience and the kind of, is it going back to your point about a wedding, right? Is college just one of those structures where you can put people realistically in shared time and space doing different things? Or do you think that there's more to that in terms of the representation of romance, emotion, maturity, sexuality?
I think partly it's that it's an engine for conflict. I think there's also an isolation to the experience that is very useful for a writer. It's the same reason that there are far more orphans in fiction than in real life. Simply, if you have to devote so much time on the page to fleshing out a social context for a character that isn't itself going to influence the actions in the text, it's just so much boilerplate, and college lets you cut past a lot of that by just having the odd phone call with the parents, say, and the characters meeting everyone for the first time, and so you can meet those characters with them instead of having to constantly digress. And I don't think that's separate from thematic concerns, because the reason that would matter to someone, it's not objectively good to strip a character of social context or to have everything come to them first for the same time as you. So the reason you would want to do that is because you wish it to be an intimate novel that focuses on the intricacies of whatever you are highlighting. If you want to write Middlemarch, you write Middlemarch. If you want to write something we were discussing earlier that we hate the word small, but if you want to write something whose scope is different, I think college lends itself very well to that. It could also just be more mundanely that there's not been a lot of Irish-specific examination of the college experience in fiction, but it is very particular going to university in this country in a way that it isn't in others, and so maybe people just want to read a book that reflects something that happened to them many decades ago.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that interests me about it is the way it becomes a new mechanism to circle back to the marriage plot, right? If we understand the marriage plot, particularly, in the kind of Austen era, as a device that allowed female characters to move up the socioeconomic chain, right? It wasn't like, Elizabeth Bennet could, say, forget this, I'm going to go get a law degree. I'm going to open my own business, right? So, so that representation of socioeconomic mobility was only available to women through marriage. And it's fascinating if you look at a lot of these campus romance novels that transition from country to city is still incredibly noisy in Ireland, right? So that, the obvious example, being, the move from Sligo to Trinity and normal people, but it is a trope that you see across a lot of these books, so the kind of ways in which a wide reading in romance fiction sort of unearths particularly distinctive qualities of national, and in this case Irish writing, I think is really interesting, because you don't see that obviously in many, there's much less sort of like, I live in Kansas and now I'm moving to Manhattan. It's there, but it's not as consistently represented in romance, or those college romances, as it is here. So it's kind of cool.
I think it also supports my theory that there's a desire to put the character in an initial vacuum or blank canvas, because the reality of college in Dublin is that most of these people are also from Dublin and are still living with their parents, and you don't see that nearly as much in Dublin set college fiction because it doesn't provide that same fascination you start.
True. Yeah. So I want to put pressure one more moment on something that brings together both the representation of relationships as well as sexuality. You've spoken a lot about polyamory in your own experience, right, and your commitment to representing that on the page. And again, I'm just kind of wondering if we put that in a romance framework, that I think goes back to your claim about the marriage plot, right, that a happy ending doesn't have to mean marriage. And I think one of the things that I love so much about both books, right, that with Exciting Times, we have what I perceived to be an open ending, but I, having gone on the internet, realized people have very strong opinions about what happened in that final scene, both of which are substantiated beautifully with close readings. It was completely inspiring as a literature teacher to watch this kind of online discourse about the conclusion of that book. But with both Exciting Times and Happy Couple, again, behaviors that might have been perceived as wildly transgressive even 2 decades ago were utterly, and I say this word not with the negative connotations that come with it, right, mundane or ordinary, but just a sort of an aspect of these people's lives that went without narratorial judgment, right? And as a result, I think you're incredibly good at provoking from readers, right, a kind of take these characters as they are. Don't judge these characters, which is threading a needle that not a lot of writers can do. So I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit in kind of general terms about what you were thinking in the representation of those relationships that still seems quite new, right? So that, what is it about that representation? I guess the obvious answer is it's something you're interested in interrogating, but sort of thinking in the kind of larger social context, where do you find a kind of push and pull in the kind of public representation of that, and what can you do with your fictional representation of that? Like, does that have a kind of activist or advocacy quality to it as a writer, or are you really just sort of working out those issues in on the page? I guess that's a very inarticulate way of asking sort of, where do you see the kind of public facing aspect of the literary representations of polyamory in your novels?
There's certainly not an activist aspect, because I would have done a terrible job if that were the case. Like, I have never portrayed polyamory. Polyamory involves honesty and fair dealing, and none of these characters do that at all. I do think, in terms of where the narratorial judgment does and does not fall, it is palpable that it's not necessarily regarded as intrinsically wrong to love multiple people, but that doesn't mean that it's polyamory. And I don't know if I ever will write about polyamory, because so far I just haven't found it narratively interesting. It's not narratively interesting to me when things go well. And quite often when things go badly in polyamory, it's because the person is no longer doing polyamory, right? It's because they're lying or what have you. And so I don't feel on any level, with any subject matter really, a compulsion to put something in a novel simply because I think it should be there. I think people should see that it happens. Non-fiction is great for that. Fiction, not at all, because if I'm writing something that I'm not fascinated by on a character level, on a prose level, then I feel dishonest as a fiction writer. I feel that I am producing propaganda, and I don't want to do that ever. But certainly the assumptions I have narratively about how things can end are shaped by the fact that I don't see monogamy as the end game necessarily. And I suppose as well, in terms of the social milieu that I'm depicting, I wasn't thinking, how do I expand these characters and how they assess things? I was just thinking, how realistically would these people think about these things? And that's of course influenced by the sorts of people that I interact with myself. And so I think there's an influence, but I don't think good fiction gets written by me anyway, by a desire to change how people see the person that you're writing about. And so I don't do that. I just write what I think will be artistically fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then obviously it's in the hands of the readers, right? I mean, because I do think about that a lot in terms of, again, Irish romance and the work that's been done by, say, Maeve Binchy's Light a Penny Candle or Marian Keyes' The Break, right? Or, even as we were talking about in Exciting Times, right? This idea of kind of the abortion narrative, and the way that these representations, right, and these kind of folding them into the lives of characters sort of helped, I think, to build a larger kind of public consensus, right, about reproductive rights, and access to abortion, that I think is a really valuable lesson, particularly for those of us who are watching these kind of retrenchments happen in other countries. So just to shift register a little bit as we near the close, I was interested in talking just a little bit about the marketing and adaptation of your works, right? So with this, I thought it was really interesting with Exciting Times, right, that you had a blurb from Zadie Smith calling it aptly very funny and really mean, and David Nichols, a sharp, smart, witty, modern love story, and Marian Keyes, as brilliant as everyone says. I devoured it. I kept seizing on paragraphs and shouting, this is the thing I was thinking but couldn't articulate. So the range of blurbs there, I think, points to, one of the things that we're interested in interrogating in the show, right, is the kind of porousness, the kind of bleed among and between Zadie Smith and David Nichols, who is, for all intents and purposes, writing romance fiction as a man, and then Marian Keyes, So when you, as a writer, to what degree are you participating in the kind of marketing and circulation and the kind of conscious representation of the text to particular audiences?
At the level of going along with everything my publisher proposes, I am very much a participant, but I make no decisions at the outset about the direction. I just say yes to things, and I much prefer it that way because I'm no good at marketing, and if I got it wrong, then I would have been responsible for the demise of my own career, so I would much rather leave it in more seasoned hands. There is a part of me and this stemmed from my being a lazy English student, I think. The best way to do literary scholarship if you're lazy is to be an absolute formalist and to only examine the text itself, because then you don't have to bring in context, you don't need to read up on the author's life, etc., etc. So it could be that I rationalised this into an approach to literary criticism, but I do deeply feel that the text is the main thing, and so there is a part of me that longs for a plain Fitzcarraldo-esque cover and no interviews and maybe not even my name on the thing and no one knows what I look like, but in the 21st century that's not realistic. I enjoy making a living from this, and in order to continue doing so, I don't cynically go along with it. I would never accept something that I found immoral or that I felt grossly misrepresented the book, but I am definitely more active in talking about my work than I would be if I were independently wealthy.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because it does seem, in talking to writers, like everywhere, that this sense, I think of being analog in some ways as being grading papers as a professor. Like, if I never had to grade another paper, fantastic, but it's what I do. That's how you make students better. And the sense that marketing has become such a kind of noisy and important part of the work that you do. I'm always curious about sort of the role that you guys play in framing the work and in circulating the work and at what level. So I guess then my next question that's kind of tied to that has to do with adaptations. So is Exciting Times being adapted into a film or a series? Oh.
No, by the time it got to the green light decision, the collapse of streaming had happened and so it's not getting made.
Do you feel like, has there been kind of, I guess the collapse of streaming is the answer to everything, but I'm curious about sort of what makes, or when you were speaking with people about the adaptation, sort of what makes people identify such a kind of thorny and complex book as something that's ripe for filmic adaptation?
I think it's the dialogue. I honestly think it's the dialogue because a lot of people don't write dialogue well, or even if they can, they choose not to, whereas I unapologetically adore a dialogue, and that helps translate everything and make it clear how that would look as a screenplay. And I hope that's not something that writers ever take prescriptively. I would hate for novels to be written in order to be adapted, but if you are someone who likes to write dialogue, this capacity that has so long gone underappreciated, it is nice that there's at least the silver lining of it being appealing for adaptation.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a lovely place where sort of commercial romance and the kind of Irish literary tradition merge, because I think, and here's where the American makes sweeping claims about the Irish literary tradition, but I do feel like the kind of basis in an oral culture, as well as the kind of living and lively and accessible theater tradition here, right, means that there's a particular kind of ear and a particular kind of training that you have as a writer that allows for the kind of sparky, complex, and riveting dialogue.
And of course, the Irish language oral tradition that is older than the English language itself.
Absolutely.
And part of why we have such an incredibly rich Irish language for things that existed when everyone was speaking it. And I mean, people are inventive with words for the new things too, but I love thinking about what a vast mind a good oral poet needs to have, what a readily accessible lexicon they need to be able to deploy instantly. And I was thinking a lot about that while reading Emily Wilson's Homer translations, because she leans into the style of the oral poet. She's not ashamed to repeat certain cliches, certain boilerplate that Homer did use, because that's the reality of winding out a poem on the spot. Readers aren't as sensitive to repetitions when they're hearing it as when they're seeing it. It's helpful, if anything. And I don't think it's bad for oral poetry to read like oral poetry, even if you are in fact reading it. And the nice thing about writing fiction then as an Irish writer is you can take the devices that our oral tradition has trained us so well, and even subconsciously, even if you've never read any of the stuff in Irish from the past or from the present, it's still there in how we talk to each other, and you can take that, make it fit the novel, don't make it fit the novel, do what you want. I think there's an inventiveness around tradition, but the theatre is a huge factor too, and that was something I found very amusing when I was doing my master's in Victorian literature at Oxford, because there are no good English 19th century playwrights, and so the people they encompassed under our scope of English
are
literature,
Irish, right? It's like Shaw and Wilde would be the ones, or or even before that Sheridan, and they're all Irish.
yeah, exactly. And so people were claimed in ways that would make the English departments here maybe raise their eyebrows a bit.
That's so funny. Well, it's interesting that you bring up Emily Wilson, because she recently spoke at Holy Cross, where I teach in the States, and talking about the role that you have to play in promoting your work, right, and kind of advocating. She was doing the same thing for her translations and her academic research, right? And she's such a kind of marvelous performer of the writing. So you can hear, like this again is what I love about your work, is I can hear the characters speaking. Like it's as if they're in the room with me. And I had felt that when she was doing home, you're just like, you could hear that so alive. And it is interesting, again, to underscore that the important role that the Irish language tradition plays in that, and the surprising places you find it. Like, I'm amazed here how many of my friends just listen to the radio. Like, they turn on RTE every single, and in the States, people might listen to NPR on their way to work, but there's not a kind of commitment to radio culture that I see here. So it's exciting, I think, to see the ways that the orality plays out. And
although we're not as into voice notes as Italians are, I think the fear of making a nuisance of oneself overrides the love of orality in this instance. Not always. I do have Irish friends who are prolific voice noters, but nothing like the Italians.
Oh,
They're
that's
mad
so
for the voice
interesting.
note.
Yes, because it's not a big thing in the States either. That's so fascinating. Yeah, and I also love the fact that one of the pieces I was reading to prep for today, you were talking about teaching yourself Italian by reading Ferrante. So it all circles back, I think, to,
It's really nice, though, because at the outset it was that my work had done well in Italy. I was very happy to have been invited there. I wanted to return some of the energy that I was receiving, but now it's gone full circle and I get invited to Italy because I speak Italian, because I can do events in Italian, because I write in Italian, and so it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is really lovely.
No, it's great. Jim Lahiri's done the same thing in the States, right? It's like there are these kind of really interesting cross currents, and the kind of, I think, attention to translation, particularly in our increasingly globalized world, is just, it's never a bad thing. And it takes a particular talent, a particular ear to be able to do that. So
And I loved something that Jim Lahiri wrote in, I think it was her first book in Italian, In altre parole, in other words, and she's talking about the unrequited nature of loving a language that will never love you back and that doesn't need you. And it's something I think a lot about in terms of Irish in this country, because I think we frame it entirely the wrong way. When we talk about, for instance, Paul Mescal saved the Irish language by speaking it for like 90 seconds. No shade on him. I thought he came across as very respectful in the interview. But the way we expect and encourage people to adopt this saviour complex towards Irish, when it should be do this for yourself, actually that's a lesson I would like Irish people to just take in every approach to everything. We should be doing things for ourselves, for our own pleasure, for our own enjoyment, for our own benefit, because that's when you actually end up contributing anyway, when you're having fun.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, and I'll use this to plug the show, because we have Maureen Gowan, who is just a breathtaking Irish language literature scholar, has written 3 entries for us on Irish language romance and given readers a bunch of titles, a lot of which actually haven't been translated into English, which is kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah, this is one of my absolute bugbears, that we will fund the translation of Irish language writers into every language but English. And the excuse they give is that it's helping the Irish language publishers, because if there were an English translation, people would just buy that. To which, first of all, like, who buys the translation when they can read the original? And second of all, how many people in this country can read the original? Like, it would only help the original if there were an English translation, because aside from anything else, maybe the English-speaking friends of the people who can read the Irish would be telling them about this great book that they just read in translation.
100%.
It's silly.
Yeah. So I've kept you here a long time, and I'm so grateful, because I could do this for 24 hours, but it's probably not fair to you. So what we're doing in closing our interviews is to ask our authors if they have a particular book of romance fiction, and it can be something as understood as highbrow as Pride and Prejudice, or something as, lowbrow as, I think I gave you my example of Kathleen Woody-Wiss's The Flame and the Flower. Although I will note that Brandon Taylor has also cited that as his guilty pleasure book. So I felt like I got a little bit of prop from that.
I love Brandon Taylor.
So good, right? Yeah. So what was a formative or a particular book of fiction that centers around romance and has a happy ending, or maybe as you like to talk about, not a happy ever after, or one that looks differently? What's one that you would cite or recommend?
I have always, for the vast majority of my life anyway, been a big Jane Eyre head, and I think it perfectly mixes high and low in that respect. In some ways it's a very dense, very complex text. In another ways it's a very classic and very cliched romance, and given the century we're in, it should be noted that Jane's happy ending is facilitated by her uncle's involvement in the slave trade, but on a formal level, it's just very well constructed, and I think we can hold these complexities as readers. We can say that it's of its time, and we can say that for many it still has value.
Yeah, no, that's such an important point because the of its time, I think, is, again, because of the fast pace of publication with commercial romance, being able to track sort of how conversations about consent, right, or condom usage, or rape, right, even marital rape, right, are so different now than they would have been in some of these books that were published in earlier centuries. And as you say, this moves to social issues as well. So Naoise, thank you so much for sitting down with us and discussing your relationship and understanding of romance and Irish fiction. As I said, I'm a shameless and noisy fan of your work, so it was a real delight to be able to talk about it with you for this show. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is David Douglas, Managing Director of EBO, the digital agency. EBO are the proud sponsors this year of Radio Molly and Molly's digital programme.